In the early hours of October 6th, at approximately 2 a.m., the quiet calm of the residential neighborhood was shattered without warning. Without a moment's hesitation, Oksana leapt out of bed and rushed to the front window. What she saw outside froze her in place. Her heart dropped. She called out to her husband, and together, still in their pajamas, barefoot and trembling with dread, they hurried downstairs. But by the time they reached the front of the building, it was already too late. She knelt beside her, gently holding her hand, whispering for her to stay awake, to stay with them, to keep her eyes open. By the time medical help arrived, Zenaida Solinari had already lost consciousness. Within minutes, she was gone. Dear viewers, thank you for choosing our video and our channel. We put a lot of effort into making sure you enjoy being with us. Zenaida Solinari came into the world on a cold winter morning, February 18, 1982, in a humble provincial town nestled in the rolling hills of southwestern Moldova. Life in that corner of Eastern Europe was often quiet, but it was not easy, especially for families like hers, who struggled to make a living amidst economic hardship. Zenaida was the firstborn of two daughters in a modest household where love was abundant, but money was always in short supply. Her parents, both hard-working individuals, labored from dawn until late into the evening. Her father held jobs in local agriculture and construction when available, while her mother took on seasonal work and cleaned houses to keep food on the table. Despite their efforts, the family rarely had more than the bare essentials. From an early age, Zenaida understood the value of perseverance. She shared a close bond with her younger sister Oksana, who was born 4 years after her. The sisters grew up like best friends, always side by side, offering each other the kind of support and understanding only siblings can provide. Their bond became a source of strength, especially during the difficult moments life would inevitably bring. As she entered her teenage years, Zenaida blossomed into a beautiful young woman. She was quiet and introspective, but carried an inner strength that many admired. Like many girls her age, she began to explore the world of emotions and relationships. At school, she met a boy, handsome, charming, and slightly older. Their youthful romance quickly turned serious, and within a few months, Zenaida discovered she was expecting a child. The news came as a shock to both of them, but while she tried to stay calm and make sense of what lay ahead, the boy panicked and soon disappeared from her life entirely. The Solinari household, though shaken by the unexpected pregnancy, chose to face the situation with courage. Her parents, while disappointed and concerned, were not the kind to turn their backs on family. They spoke at length about the options available, but ultimately decided that terminating the pregnancy was not something they could morally or emotionally support. They worried about how such a decision could affect Zenaida's health or fertility later on. Most of all, they wanted her to know she wouldn't be alone. In November 1998, at the age of just 16, Zenaida gave birth to a baby girl whom she lovingly named Vitalia. Though still a child herself in many ways, she embraced motherhood with a maturity far beyond her years. With the help of her parents, she balanced diapers and midnight feedings with her final years of school. After graduating, Zenaida found herself faced with an increasingly uncertain future. Opportunities in her town were limited, and jobs were scarce. She worked whenever she could, babysitting, cleaning, helping out at markets, but these odd jobs barely covered the cost of living, let alone allowed for long-term planning. She began to dream of something better, something far from the narrow streets of her hometown. By the time she turned 21, Zenaida had made a life-altering decision. She would leave Moldova in search of a more stable and promising life, not just for herself, but for her daughter. She chose Italy, a country she had heard was more welcoming to foreign workers and full of opportunities for those willing to work hard. In the spring of 2004, she packed their few belongings, kissed her parents and sister goodbye, and boarded a bus bound for Bergamo, a picturesque city in northern Italy surrounded by the Alps. Upon arrival, Zenaida was struck by the beauty of her new surroundings: historic architecture, cobblestone streets, and the hum of daily life so different from what she had known. She quickly found a small apartment to rent and began working as a waitress at a busy local trattoria. The hours were long and the language barrier initially daunting, but Zenaida was determined. Her focus was on giving Vitalia the chance for a brighter future. Her dedication didn't go unnoticed. With her graceful demeanor, warm smile, and striking physical features, she began to attract attention from some of the restaurant's regular customers. But despite this interest, Zenaida made it clear. She was not seeking fleeting attention. She wanted stability, emotional safety, and a partner who would not only love her, but also accept her daughter as part of the equation. One day, while waiting tables, she met Maurizio Quattrocchi, a tall, confident man with a calm manner and kind eyes. He was nearly 12 years her senior and worked in construction as a stonemason and interior finisher. From the moment they met, he was persistent in his charm. Maurizio brought flowers to the restaurant, left generous tips, and soon began inviting Zenaida and her daughter on weekend outings to scenic spots in and around Bergamo. He was attentive, always asking how they were doing, and made an effort to connect with young Vitalia, bringing her little gifts and making her laugh. Zenaida was touched. No one had ever treated her and her daughter with such tenderness and consistency. Though cautious at first, she gradually allowed herself to believe that this man might be different. The age difference didn't faze her. What mattered more was how he made her feel, seen, supported, and respected. Within months, their relationship evolved into something more serious. Maurizio expressed a desire to adopt Vitalia officially if they ever married, a gesture that deeply moved Zenaida and made her feel he was truly invested in their future together. By the end of that same year, after just 6 months of dating, Maurizio proposed. Overwhelmed by emotion and hope, Zenaida accepted. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter, one defined by security, love, and a sense of belonging. However, not all was as it seemed. Unbeknownst to Zenaida, her fiancé had a complicated past. Over the years, Maurizio had come under police scrutiny for a variety of nonviolent offenses. He had been involved in minor fraud cases and had a history of purchasing and reselling stolen items. There were also a few instances involving reckless driving. Though none of these incidents had led to serious legal consequences, they painted a picture of someone who hadn't always made the best choices. Yet during their courtship, he kept these details hidden. Zenaida only learned about his record after they were already married. When the truth emerged, she was hurt, but chose to believe that people could change. She convinced herself that those incidents were mistakes from his younger years and not reflective of the man he was becoming. She clung to the hope that the love he had shown her and her daughter was real and would outweigh whatever shadows lingered from his past. Even when he occasionally showed flashes of a temper, she told herself it was stress or exhaustion and didn't read too much into it. In 2005, the couple held a simple but heartfelt wedding ceremony attended by a few close friends and colleagues. They even managed a modest honeymoon in Spain, traveling through Barcelona and Valencia, taking in the sights and sharing their hopes for the future. Upon their return to Bergamo, Maurizio followed through on his promise and legally adopted Vitalia, who had already started calling him Papa with affection. Later that same year, Zenaida discovered she was expecting again. In December 2005, she gave birth to their first child together, a daughter. It was a moment of joy for the young family. 4 years later, in 2009, Zenaida gave birth once more, this time to another baby girl. After their wedding and the birth of their daughters, Maurizio began encouraging Zenaida to leave her job and dedicate herself fully to raising their children and managing the household. He was firm about his expectations, frequently stating that a real family needed a woman who focused on the home. At the time, his income was steady, and his job in construction offered enough to comfortably support them. Trusting in his promises and eager to provide stability for her daughters, Zenaida agreed. She resigned from her position and embraced her new role as a full-time mother and homemaker. The early years of their marriage, especially the initial 3 or 4, were calm and relatively happy. Their lives unfolded in a peaceful rhythm. Zenaida created a warm, welcoming home, and her daughters thrived in a structured environment filled with routine and love. They lived in a modest but cozy house in a quiet part of Bergamo. The children attended a well-respected local school known for its safe environment and excellent teachers. On the surface, everything appeared to be going well. During this time, a joyful development brought new hope into Zenaida's life. Her younger sister, Oksana, who had remained in Moldova, decided to move to Italy. The sisters had always been extremely close, so Oksana's relocation to Bergamo in the early 2010 felt like a major turning point. With her sister now nearby, Zenaida felt less isolated. She finally had someone she could truly talk to, someone who knew her history, her values, and the emotional weight of everything she carried. The two sisters saw each other regularly and supported one another in both practical and emotional ways. However, despite having lived in Italy for several years by that point, Zenaida realized she hadn't developed any real friendships beyond her family. It wasn't due to a lack of effort or social opportunity, but rather because of Maurizio. Over time, he had revealed himself to be far more controlling than she initially realized. His warm and generous exterior masked a deeply possessive nature. He closely monitored her conversations, discouraged her from forming new relationships, and subtly restricted her independence in ways that felt suffocating. At first, she excused his behavior. She told herself he was simply passionate and overly protective. When he raised his voice or questioned her whereabouts, she explained it away as a cultural difference, something about fiery tempers and intense emotions. She chalked it up to personality, not a red flag. To friends and acquaintances, she laughed it off. "He's just being a typical Italian," she'd say. But deep down, she felt the strain. It's important to note that during these years, Maurizio never used physical violence. That's one of the key reasons Zenaida stayed. To the outside world, and even to herself, she could still justify remaining in the relationship. He hadn't crossed any obvious, unforgivable lines. But what he did resort to was harder to see, yet equally destructive. Emotional manipulation, verbal intimidation, and psychological pressure. He questioned her motives, challenged her independence, and often made her feel as though she owed him everything. Over time, these behaviors chipped away at her self-esteem and sense of freedom. Despite these struggles, he remained a devoted father to their daughters. He attended parent-teacher meetings, helped with homework, and played with the children in the evenings. The girls adored him. To them, he was Dad. Present, involved, and caring. That duality made things even more confusing for Zenaida. She wanted to preserve the family structure for her children's sake. She kept telling herself that maybe he would change again, that perhaps it was just a phase. As the girls grew older and began school full-time, Zenaida's daily routine began to shift. With more free time, she started engaging with other parents, joining the school's parent committee, and even taking Italian language classes to improve her fluency. Slowly, she began to reclaim pieces of her identity. She even started considering a return to part-time work, something flexible that wouldn't interfere with the girls' schedules but could help the family financially and give her a sense of purpose outside the home. However, her renewed independence triggered a sharp change in Maurizio's behavior. He became increasingly agitated, his jealousy growing by the day. Friendly chats with other parents at school became interrogations at home. If Zenaida received a phone call, he wanted to know who it was. If she ran errands for too long, he demanded explanations. He developed a habit of scrolling through her phone, checking her messages, reviewing her contact lists, and inspecting her social media accounts. Over time, he even insisted that she cut ties with certain friends unless he personally approved of them. By this point, Maurizio had become a skilled manipulator, knowing exactly how to guilt-trip and emotionally destabilize his wife. He played on her vulnerabilities, reminding her that she and the children relied on his income and making her feel incapable of managing on her own. He never needed to raise a hand. His control came through words, tone, and implication. To Zenaida, it felt like living in a cage without walls. In private, she began confiding in one of the few friends she had left, someone who had noticed her growing tension and isolation. "I don't feel safe anymore," she whispered during one conversation. "Not physically, he hasn't hurt me, but I'm constantly anxious. I never know what version of him I'll get when he walks through the door." She also shared her growing concerns with her sister Oksana, expressing doubts about the future of her marriage. She talked about the possibility of divorce but feared the consequences. Most of all, she worried that if they separated, Maurizio might try to take custody of the girls. He was their legal father, after all. Meanwhile, Maurizio's personal issues deepened. He had begun drinking more heavily, especially on weekends or after arguments. Under the influence, he often became someone unrecognizable, louder, more confrontational, and completely unwilling to listen. He was no longer the man she had fallen in love with years before. The situation worsened dramatically in late 2018. After a heated dispute with his supervisors, reportedly over a disagreement about workplace policies, Maurizio abruptly quit his longtime job. Rather than reflecting on the incident or trying to find compromise, he blamed everyone else and walked away. He soon took a position at a local pizzeria, but the pattern repeated itself. He clashed with the manager, stirred conflict with coworkers, and eventually left that job as well. With no steady income, the family's financial security collapsed almost overnight. Zenaida tried to remain hopeful and supportive, but Maurizio's behavior only deteriorated. Instead of searching for new employment seriously, he cycled through odd jobs while continuing to drink and direct his frustration at home. The pressure on Zenaida grew unbearable. By early 2019, Zenaida realized she had to act. Their savings were nearly gone. The children's needs were growing, and the environment at home was increasingly unstable. She found a job as a waitress at one of Bergamo's most well-regarded restaurants. Soon after Zenaida began working again, a subtle but unmistakable shift began taking place in their household dynamic. For years, Maurizio had been used to having full control over his wife's daily routines, social interactions, and movements. Her decision to rejoin the workforce not only interrupted that pattern, it deeply threatened his sense of dominance and stability. What started as passive resentment quickly spiraled into something far more aggressive and troubling. Already prone to jealousy, Maurizio now became consumed by an irrational fear that he was losing control. The very idea that his wife was spending long hours away from home, interacting with colleagues, patrons, and strangers, triggered emotional tailspins. He would question her relentlessly each evening, launching into lengthy monologues filled with accusations, suspicions, and imaginary scenarios. His interrogations became part of their daily routine. "Who did you talk to today? Why didn't you answer your phone immediately? Why were you smiling in that photo?" Zenaida, now shouldering the responsibility of financially supporting her daughters, knew she couldn't afford to give in. Her position at the restaurant was not just a job, it was their family's lifeline. The salary, paired with generous tips, often surpassed what Maurizio had ever managed to earn consistently. This financial shift not only wounded his pride, but fueled a growing hostility that he couldn't contain. Rather than acknowledge her efforts, Maurizio began tearing her down. The emotional temperature at home grew colder with each passing day. At the same time, he abandoned all pretense of job hunting and turned increasingly to alcohol as a means of escape, numbing himself to the reality that his wife was now the pillar of the household. Soon, his possessiveness escalated into surveillance. He demanded constant video calls, regardless of time or place, to prove where she was and who she was with. During her shifts, he would message incessantly, call repeatedly, and insist that she check in with photos or videos. This disruptive behavior began interfering with her duties at the restaurant. Her manager issued a warning, and she faced the very real possibility of losing her job if it continued. To protect her position, Zenaida made the difficult decision to turn off her phone during work hours. She hoped that with time, Maurizio would come to accept her new role in the family. But instead of adapting, he unraveled further. Unable to reach her, he grew angrier by the day. Within just 2 weeks, He began appearing unannounced at her workplace. At first, he lingered outside. But as time went on, his confrontations became more overt. He would enter the restaurant during busy hours and demand to speak with her, causing scenes that left both staff and customers deeply uncomfortable. On multiple occasions, he raised his voice and hurled accusations at her in front of everyone. A fellow waitress named Lydia, who had grown close to Zenaida, later recalled how she would physically shake when she saw him enter the room. Her whole posture would change, Lydia said. She looked smaller, like she was trying to disappear. Lydia tried to intervene when possible, gently guiding Maurizio outside to calm him down. But his presence alone left a cloud of tension over the workplace. Zenaida, who once greeted guests with a warm smile and genuine kindness, now looked perpetually distracted. She flinched at sudden movements or loud noises. Her eyes darted frequently toward the door, as though expecting him to walk in at any moment. With 3 children to support and little to no help from her husband, Zenaida secured a second job as a part-time housekeeper at a well-rated local hotel. Though the hours were long and exhausting, she remained determined to provide her daughters with stability and basic comfort. And then, something unexpected happened. She received a modeling offer from a local fashion agency. They were seeking everyday women for a series of lifestyle photo campaigns and saw something unique in Zenaida's natural elegance and striking appearance. For the first time in years, she felt seen in a positive light. The offer was professional and paid well. She took on several photo shoots, balancing them between her 2 jobs and her duties at home. Her confidence began to return, but so did Maurizio's rage. Unable to tolerate her success, he sank further into destructive behavior. His drinking became a daily occurrence, and his outbursts escalated from verbal attacks to something darker. Home was no longer a safe haven. It had become a battleground of suspicion, shouting, and relentless criticism. In late July 2019, everything changed. For years, Maurizio's cruelty had been verbal and psychological. But on one sweltering evening, the tension that had been building finally broke. He crossed a boundary that had never been breached before. What began as an argument turned into something far more alarming. That night marked a turning point. What had once been emotional strain now crossed into open aggression. Over the following weeks, this pattern repeated. Zenaida, already exhausted from juggling 2 jobs and raising 3 children, now had to navigate an increasingly volatile home life. But despite the fear, she tried to find the right moment to confront the situation head-on. One afternoon, when he was unusually calm and sober, she sat him down for a serious conversation. She explained that the marriage was no longer sustainable, that she wanted a divorce, not out of hatred, but out of necessity. Maurizio did not take it well. He erupted in fury, pacing the room and shouting. He told her he would never let her go, that she belonged to him, and that if she ever tried to leave, there would be serious consequences. His words turned dark, implying that he would rather destroy everything than watch her walk away. It was no longer just jealousy or wounded pride. It was obsession. This time, something inside Zenaida snapped. She could no longer dismiss his behavior as passion or cultural temperament. She feared for her safety and for the well-being of her daughters. Trembling, she called the local police and asked for help. When officers arrived, they found her visibly shaken. She explained the situation, outlining her fears, and pleaded for assistance, not in filing charges, but in helping her safely remove herself and her daughters from the house. The officers, while supportive, encouraged her to press charges. They explained that without official documentation, her ability to get legal protection might be limited. But Zenaida, ever cautious, declined. She didn't want to escalate the situation further, at least not yet. All she asked was to leave safely, without confrontation. That same day, she packed a few essentials and took her 3 daughters to her sister Oksana's home. Oksana welcomed them without hesitation. There was no judgment, only compassion. Her house became a temporary refuge, offering emotional and physical safety during one of the most terrifying periods of Zenaida's life. In the privacy of her sister's kitchen, Over cups of tea and muffled sobs, Zenaida shared the full truth for the first time. She admitted she no longer felt safe, not just emotionally, but physically. Oksana was heartbroken to hear it. Ironically, she was married to one of Maurizio's cousins, but her own marriage was a stark contrast. Her husband, calm and supportive, had always distanced himself from Maurizio's behavior. Together, they urged Zenaida to go to the authorities, to file an official report and seek protection through the legal system. But once again, she hesitated. The following morning began with tense preparation. Zenaida knew she had to return to the home she once shared with Maurizio, but not alone. It was no longer just a house. It was a place clouded with dread, unpredictability, and memories that had become too heavy to carry. Her sister's husband, calm but firm in his resolve, offered to accompany her. He was determined to ensure she could gather her belongings without intimidation or disruption, and to stand as a buffer in case another one of Maurizio's unpredictable episodes erupted. As expected, Maurizio was waiting. The moment they stepped through the gate, his face turned stormy. His emotions spiraled immediately into rage. He shouted, pleaded, and demanded that his wife return home. He refused to believe this was truly happening, that Zenaida was actually leaving. But this time, there was no room for negotiation. Her mind was made up. Her brother-in-law didn't engage with emotion. Calmly but firmly, he stood between the two and warned Maurizio that if he attempted to block her from leaving or interfered in any way, the police would be called. The authority in his voice had the desired effect. Maurizio, though visibly seething, backed down and stepped aside. He watched silently, jaw clenched, as Zenaida packed up essential items, some clothes, documents, and keepsakes for the girls. The home she once kept so carefully now felt cold and unfamiliar. But walking out the door did not mean the nightmare was over. In fact, in many ways, it had just entered its most dangerous phase. It didn't take long for Maurizio to figure out where she had gone. On the evening of October 5th, just before sunset, around 6 p.m., Maurizio appeared outside Oksana's apartment. He was visibly intoxicated, his clothes disheveled, eyes glassy. The apartment complex was located on a quiet residential street, Via Cremona, lined with identical buildings and modest balconies. He rang the doorbell repeatedly, then began shouting, asking to see Zenaida. Oksana opened the door just wide enough to speak through the crack. She was calm but firm. She told him he was in no condition to have a civil conversation, and that if he genuinely wanted to talk, he should return when sober, respectful, and clear-minded. She then closed the door, locking it behind her. Maurizio yelled in frustration but eventually retreated. Or so it seemed. Instead of leaving the area, he lingered. He began walking aimlessly around the apartment complex, pacing in the dim light, watching from corners, and occasionally peering up at the building's windows. The residents began to notice. His behavior was unsettling, and it wasn't long before Oksana picked up the phone and called the police. She explained the situation in detail, asked for a wellness check, and requested that they investigate the area. Around 11 p.m., a patrol car arrived. The officers scanned the premises, walked around the complex, and even checked the nearby alleyways and courtyards. But by the time they got there, Maurizio was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps he had hidden. Perhaps he had driven off temporarily. Either way, nothing suspicious was found, and after about 40 minutes, the officers left. But the tension didn't. Not long after midnight, as Oksana's husband returned from a brief trip to a nearby store, he noticed something off. Parked just a few meters down the street was an older gray Peugeot 207, an all-too-familiar vehicle. It looked almost identical to the one Maurizio used to drive. He mentioned it to Oksana, and together they decided to search the apartment complex grounds once more, this time with flashlights. But despite their efforts, they couldn't find any sign of him. The car seemed empty. The driver was nowhere in sight. Still uneasy, Oksana sent her sister a message. "Please be careful. Let us know the moment you get home. We'll come down and walk with you." But by this point, after so many years of living under stress and constant worry, Zenaida had developed a tolerance for fear. It had, sadly, become part of her routine. She replied with a short message. "Don't worry, I'm fine." Then silence. She promised she would call the moment she arrived. But no call ever came. That single missed call would become a moment her loved ones would regret for the rest of their lives. In the early hours of October 6th, around 2 a.m., the silence of the residential night was suddenly interrupted. A sharp noise echoed through the stillness. Startled, Oksana and her husband woke instantly. Their bedroom faced the rear courtyard, so they couldn't immediately see what had caused the commotion. But something deep within Oksana stirred. A mother's instinct, a sister's intuition. She ran from the bedroom to the front window, and what she saw made her blood run cold. She didn't wait for questions. She called her husband, and the two of them rushed downstairs in their pajamas, barefoot and trembling. By the time they reached the front of the building, it was too late. Several neighbors had already gathered, some on their phones with emergency services. Paramedics had been called. In the chaos, it took a moment for Oksana to register what had happened. She knelt beside her, gently holding her hand, whispering for her to stay awake, to stay with them, to keep her eyes open. But the injuries were too severe. By the time medical help arrived, Zenaida had already lost consciousness. Within minutes, she was gone. What followed was a whirlwind of heartbreak and urgency. The grief was immediate, but so was the certainty. There was no question about who had done this. Oksana and her husband gave the officers everything they needed: a name, a photo, the make and model of his car, his known habits, and his last known address. A citywide alert was issued within the hour. Surveillance cameras captured footage of a gray Peugeot speeding away from the scene. Using license plate recognition, law enforcement tracked the car leaving Bergamo and heading toward a rural district. Authorities believed the suspect may have parked the car and continued on foot, hoping to hide in nearby wooded or agricultural zones. Roadblocks were quickly set up on highways and exit routes. Helicopters were placed on standby. But despite these efforts, Maurizio managed to evade capture for nearly 20 hours. His plan, however, lacked preparation. He had no supplies, no hideout, and no allies. It was clear he was acting on impulse rather than logic. Eventually, later that evening, October 6th, just past 8 p.m., his attempt to refuel the car at a small suburban gas station led to his arrest. A cashier, recognizing the vehicle from a local alert, discreetly notified police. Officers arrived moments later and took him into custody without incident. At the time of his arrest, Maurizio had sobered up considerably. During initial questioning, he appeared calm, composed, even apologetic. He claimed he could not remember the full events of the previous night, citing alcohol as the cause of his confusion. He told investigators he still loved his wife and insisted he had hoped to reconcile with her. According to him, it had all been a terrible misunderstanding, an accident that spiraled out of control, but investigators weren't convinced. As questioning continued, Maurizio admitted he had followed her. He admitted showing up that night to talk, but when asked about the knife, his story fell apart. He initially claimed he didn't bring any weapon, that he had found one lying on the ground near Oksana's home and picked it up without thinking. But a later search of his home disproved that statement entirely. In the days following the tragedy, investigators meticulously combed through the evidence, determined to reconstruct the exact series of events that led to the harrowing night of October 6th. Surveillance footage, witness statements, forensic data, and digital records allowed law enforcement to piece together the full, chilling picture. The investigation confirmed what prosecutors would later argue in court. This was not a crime born out of a spontaneous outburst. The premeditation was clear. The legal proceedings began in December 2019, less than 3 months after the crime that had shocked the community. He admitted to feeling regret, but stopped short of accepting full responsibility. Maurizio was facing a possible life sentence for the charges brought against him. The legal team on both sides braced for a lengthy trial. But before the proceedings could conclude, a startling and abrupt development brought the entire process to a standstill. One morning, just days before the final stage of sentencing, prison staff found Maurizio unresponsive in his cell. Despite immediate efforts by medical personnel, he was pronounced dead at the scene. The justice system would never deliver its final verdict. While the night at Pyrenees Castle unfolded in complete stillness, almost unnervingly calm. Nothing suggested that anything was amiss. But at around 5 o'clock in the morning, that fragile calm was torn apart. From the quiet came a sudden, piercing sound that cut through the air and reverberated across the grounds. It was sharp, violent, and so distinct that Adriano immediately froze. His breath caught in his chest. To his ears, there could be no mistake. It sounded like the crack of a gunshot. Panic surged through him. His fingers trembled as he reached for his phone and dialed 911. When the operator answered, his voice was urgent and unsteady, as he struggled to convey what he had just heard. Within minutes, flashing lights approached the gates of the estate. Police officers moved quickly but cautiously, their arrival charged with unease. The mansion loomed before them, quiet again, yet shrouded now in suspicion and dread. Gaining entry was no simple matter. Officers had to press forward with firm but careful maneuvering, uncertain of what awaited them inside. And then came the grim discovery. Within the grand home, they found confirmation of Adriano's worst fears. Lana Clarkson was no longer alive. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Lana Clarkson was born on April 5, 1962, in the seaside city of Long Beach, California. Her parents, Donna and James Clarkson, welcomed her into a world that combined the warmth of family values with the opportunities of Southern California living. She grew up with two siblings, Jesse and Fawn, who would remain central figures throughout her life. From an early age, Lana's surroundings shaped her worldview. Sunlit beaches, bustling coastal streets, and the open promise of the Pacific Ocean were all part of her childhood backdrop. When Lana was still very young, the family relocated to Sonoma County, a region of Northern California celebrated for its vineyards, rustic farmlands, and rolling green hills. Unlike the crowded urban lifestyle of Long Beach, Sonoma offered a quieter, more natural setting, where children could roam through meadows, ride bikes along winding country roads, and breathe in the scent of fresh grapes ripening in the sun. It was here, in the heart of California's wine country, that Lana learned to appreciate beauty, freedom, and the sense of community that small-town life provided. Friends remembered her as an imaginative child who often dreamed aloud about the future, already hinting at a spark that set her apart. Yet, despite the idyllic surroundings, Lana's early years were marked by tragedy. The sudden passing of her father left a deep void in the Clarkson household. For Lana, the loss was more than just the absence of a parent. It was the abrupt ending of childhood security. Her mother, Donna, became the family's foundation, guiding her three children through grief with strength and resilience. The holiday season of 1978 was especially difficult, etched forever in memory as a time of painful transition. Soon after, seeking both new beginnings and better opportunities, the family decided to move south to Los Angeles. By this point, Lana had completed high school, and her passion for the arts was undeniable. She didn't simply want a traditional career path. She envisioned a future lit by cameras, scripts, and stages. Acting was more than an interest, it was a calling. With her statuesque height, nearly 6 feet tall, combined with long blonde hair, bright eyes, and an unmistakable aura of charisma, she seemed destined for the screen. Those who knew her personally often described her as adventurous, warm-hearted, and open to life's possibilities. She exuded confidence without arrogance, and her free-spirited nature made her memorable to everyone she met. Entering the entertainment industry in the early 1980s, Lana began with small but significant steps. She took on extra work in television and film productions, gaining first-hand experience in the mechanics of Hollywood. These roles were modest, background appearances, single-scene cameos, but they were crucial building blocks. For a young actress, every moment on a professional set was a lesson in craft and perseverance. At the same time, Lana gave her energy to causes larger than herself. In 1980, she became a volunteer for Project Angel Food, an organization committed to delivering meals to individuals battling HIV and other critical illnesses. During an era when stigma and misunderstanding surrounded the disease, Lana's choice to help spoke volumes about her courage and compassion. Her involvement revealed that, beyond the ambition of an actress, she was a woman deeply connected to empathy and service. Her first notable screen appearance came in 1982, with a small role in Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Though brief, it placed her within the orbit of a film that would go on to become iconic in American cinema. The following year brought another opportunity, this time in Scarface, directed by Brian De Palma. Sharing a scene with Michelle Pfeiffer, even if only for moments, was a highlight for an aspiring performer. That same year, 1983, she took on a more prominent part in Deathstalker, a fantasy adventure that would later achieve cult status. But the turning point came in 1985 with the release of Barbarian Queen. In this film, Lana played Athea, a warrior heroine who embodied strength, resilience, and determination. The role showcased her ability to balance physical power with grace, and the performance resonated with audiences. Over time, the film developed its own loyal following, ensuring that Lana would forever be remembered as the Barbarian Queen. For many fans, this role defined her career, creating a lasting image of a bold and fearless woman on screen. She continued working steadily in the years that followed, appearing in projects such as Blind Date, directed by Nico Mastorakis, and making cameo appearances in ensemble productions like Amazon Women on the Moon, 1987. Her career branched into television commercials, guest roles, and high-profile modeling campaigns, including work with Mercedes-Benz. These opportunities took her far beyond California. Lana's professional journey allowed her to travel widely. She visited Japan, Greece, Argentina, Italy, Switzerland, France, Jamaica, and Mexico. Each new country expanded her experiences and enriched her outlook on life, proof that acting was not just about fame, but also about adventure and discovery. Despite her undeniable talent and striking appearance, Lana's career never fully reached the heights she envisioned. Hollywood can be unpredictable, and many talented performers struggle against the industry's shifting tides. Still, Lana remained visible, particularly within the world of comic and fan conventions. There, devoted admirers, many of whom had first seen her as the warrior Athea, stood in long lines for autographs and photos. These conventions became more than just professional obligations. They were gatherings where Lana could directly connect with people who genuinely appreciated her work. She may not have reached mainstream stardom, but within certain circles, she achieved the rare status of cult icon. By the late 1990s, Lana began looking for new ways to reinvent herself and sustain her career. Always ahead of the curve, she recognized the growing potential of the internet as a platform for artists to connect directly with their audiences. Through her website, Lana Clarkson was able to do more than just stay visible in an industry that often forgets its performers once the spotlight dims. She sold DVDs of her films, many of them autographed personally with warm notes of gratitude, and used the platform to connect directly with her supporters. The site featured a fan message board, where people shared memories of her films, offered encouragement, and sometimes even wrote about how her roles had inspired them during their own lives. For Lana, this was more than a business venture. It was a lifeline, a reminder that she was still appreciated, still remembered, and still admired. It provided her with not only an additional source of income, but also a sense of community and validation at a time when Hollywood had become increasingly competitive and selective. However, as the new millennium began, the realities of her profession grew sharper. By the time Lana reached her early 40s, acting opportunities had slowed considerably. The landscape of Hollywood had changed, and roles for women, especially those past their 20s and 30s, were fewer than ever. Auditions that once seemed promising now ended in disappointment, and phone calls that used to bring offers now went unanswered. Despite her optimism and determination, it became impossible to sustain herself as a full-time actress. Faced with these challenges, Lana made a practical choice. She began seeking part-time work outside of film while still keeping herself close to the entertainment world. In January 2003, she accepted a job as a hostess at the House of Blues, a well-known Los Angeles venue that attracted celebrities, music lovers, and industry figures alike. The club, located on the Sunset Strip, had become a landmark of nightlife, famous for its intimate stage, eclectic performances, and the mix of Hollywood insiders who gathered there after hours. The position wasn't glamorous by Hollywood standards, but it provided stability. Lana's responsibilities were to greet high-profile guests, ensure their comfort, and help manage the exclusive VIP areas. For someone who had always thrived on personal connections, the job suited her naturally outgoing personality. Colleagues later described her as warm, approachable, and professional. She treated every guest with dignity, whether they were world-famous artists or everyday patrons enjoying a night out. On the evening of February 3, 2003, Lana reported to work as usual. The atmosphere at the House of Blues was energetic, alive with the sounds of live music and conversation. To her, it was just another night of balancing grace with responsibility, making sure the venue's most important visitors felt welcome. What she could not have known, however, was that this night would alter the course of her life. Among the guests who entered the club was one of the most celebrated yet controversial figures in music history, record producer Phil Spector. Their encounter seemed unremarkable at first, just another introduction in the swirl of nightlife. But in hindsight, this chance meeting would set into motion one of the most unsettling stories in modern Hollywood history. To understand the weight of this moment, it is essential to step back and look at the life of Phil Spector himself, a man whose genius was matched only by his complexity. Phil Spector was born Harvey Philip Spector on December 26, 1939, in the Bronx, New York. He came into the world during a time of change in America, but his own childhood was marked by hardship. When Phil was only 9 years old, tragedy entered his life in a way that left permanent scars. On April 20th, 1949, his father took his own life inside a car by carbon monoxide poisoning. For a young boy already navigating the struggles of childhood, the loss was devastating. The event haunted him for decades and shaped the lens through which he viewed the world. In 1953, Phil's mother, hoping to escape painful memories, moved the family across the country to Los Angeles. There, young Phil began to find a refuge in music. By his late teens, he was enrolled in college, but far more drawn to creative pursuits than academics. In his spare time, he connected with other aspiring musicians and soon formed a group called the Teddy Bears. In this trio, Phil played guitar and wrote songs, channeling his grief and ambition into lyrics and melodies. Their breakthrough came with a deeply personal composition. Drawing inspiration from the words engraved on his father's tombstone, Phil wrote, "To know him is to love him." Released in 1958, the single quickly rose to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Practically overnight, the Teddy Bears found themselves thrust into the national spotlight. By December of that year, their song was being played on radio stations across America, and Phil, barely 19 years old, had already achieved the kind of success most musicians could only dream of. Yet fame is fickle. While "To Know Him is to Love Him" soared, subsequent songs by the Teddy Bears failed to capture the same magic. By 1959, the group dissolved, leaving Phil in a period of professional uncertainty. For a time, he withdrew, but eventually he returned to the industry with renewed focus, this time determined not to stand in front of the microphone, but to command the controls behind it. It was as a producer that he would find his true voice. Phil began his producing career modestly, collaborating with others at Junior Records. But his ambitions were larger than the small-scale projects he was assigned. In October 1962, at just 22 years old, he boldly bought out his partners and assumed complete ownership of the label. Under his leadership, it was renamed Phillies Records. From this platform, Phil launched a series of singles that reshaped popular music. His innovative approach, later dubbed the Wall of Sound, layered instruments and voices in ways no one had heard before. The results were electrifying. Within just a few years, Phillies had sold over 13 million records, produced 21 singles, and earned 9 gold records. By 21, Phil Spector wasn't simply a rising talent. He was a millionaire and a central figure in shaping the sound of American music. In his early days as a producer, Spector worked with some of the greatest voices of the era, including Elvis Presley and Roy Orbison. His reputation grew rapidly, and by the early 1960s, he was regarded as one of the most innovative young minds in the recording industry. But the true turning point came in 1963, when he encountered a young girl group performing under the name the Darling Sisters. Recognizing their potential, Spector transformed them into the Ronettes, a trio consisting of sisters Ronnie and Estelle Bennett, along with their cousin Nedra Talley. With Phil Spector stepping into the role of producer and visionary, everything about the Ronettes transformed. Their sound, their stage presence, even their physical image was reshaped under his meticulous guidance. He understood that audiences in the 1960s wanted more than just a catchy melody. They wanted an experience. Spector orchestrated everything from the boldness of their harmonies to the way they moved under the spotlight, creating a complete package that was impossible to ignore. Under his direction, the Ronettes became one of the most recognizable and enduring acts of their time, carving out a permanent place in the history of popular music. During this same period, Spector unveiled what would become his most influential contribution to the craft of recording, the now legendary Wall of Sound. This production style was a breakthrough in music history. By layering multiple instruments, often several guitars, pianos, horns, and percussion, and then blending them with layered vocals, Spector created recordings that seemed to resonate with symphonic depth. The result was a lush, orchestral quality that filled every corner of the song. When played on radios, jukeboxes, or concert speakers, it was impossible to miss. His records didn't just play, they surrounded the listener, enveloping them in a dramatic and powerful wave of sound. This innovation not only set him apart from other producers, but also cemented his reputation as an unrivaled genius in the studio. Critics, fellow musicians, and industry leaders credited him with reshaping the very mechanics of how pop and rock music were created. The Wall of Sound became a standard studied and admired by generations of producers who followed. As Spector's reputation grew, so did his list of collaborators. Over the decades, he worked with some of the most celebrated and influential names in music. His touch could be heard on records by the Ramones, Tina Turner, Cher, John Lennon, and George Harrison. He played an especially pivotal role for the two former Beatles. After the group's breakup, both Lennon and Harrison turned to Spector when they needed someone to bring unfinished material from the Get Back sessions to completion. Those recordings were transformed into what became the iconic Let It Be album. Having Phil Spector attached to a project was a mark of prestige, a stamp that the music would carry weight and distinction. But prestige had its price. Behind the curtain of fame and fortune existed another Phil Spector, one whose behavior was frequently described as unpredictable, domineering, and even frightening. Stories began to circulate about his darker tendencies, both in his personal relationships and within the confines of the recording studio. Artists and acquaintances described him as a man who thrived on control, often resorting to manipulation and intimidation to maintain it. Some accounts painted him as volatile, swinging between moments of charm and explosive episodes of anger. This troubling pattern spilled into his professional environment. Members of the Ramones recounted unsettling moments in the studio, including one infamous incident when Spector brandished a firearm and fired shots during a session. Even John Lennon, who had worked alongside many intense personalities throughout his career, reportedly felt shaken after Spector discharged a gun at the ceiling while the two were collaborating. These accounts, retold by musicians and insiders, built a picture of a man whose brilliance was often accompanied by behavior that left others uneasy. His personal life reflected a similar turbulence. Spector married twice and, at different points, raised children, some adopted, others biological. Yet those who knew him privately often described a household filled with instability. His relationships with partners and family members were marked by stories of controlling and erratic behavior, traits that mirrored what many experienced professionally. By the early 2000s, Spector's legacy was complicated. To the public, he remained a musical legend, someone whose innovations had shaped entire eras of sound. But within the industry, whispers grew louder. He was brilliant, yes, but unpredictable and often dangerous to be around. He carried an aura of power, and yet it was shadowed by mistrust. On the evening of February 3, 2003, Phil Spector arrived at the House of Blues in Los Angeles, a venue well known for its live performances and celebrity clientele. That night, Lana Clarkson was working her shift as a hostess, greeting guests and ensuring VIP patrons felt comfortable. Accounts from the evening differ slightly, but most agree on key details. Spector entered with another woman and was visibly intoxicated. When Lana approached to welcome him, she did not immediately recognize who he was. Some stories suggest she even mistook him for a woman at first, an error that bruised the pride of a man who thrived on recognition and deference. To someone with Spector's ego, this was no small misstep. Realizing her mistake, Lana reportedly tried to recover quickly, offering him attentive service despite the busy pace of the night. According to some, she worked extra hard to make him feel respected, understanding that figures of his stature often expected nothing less. Other versions of the evening suggest a different motivation, that Lana had recognized him after all and, knowing his reputation as a powerful figure in music, believed giving him extra attention might open professional doors. Perhaps she thought kindness could lead to opportunity. Whatever the exact truth, the two crossed paths in a way that fatefully linked their stories together. As closing time neared, most patrons began leaving, and Lana prepared to finish her shift. But Phil had other plans. Rather than ending the night, he extended an invitation to her. He asked Lana to accompany him back to his home for a drink, a request that, on the surface, might have seemed casual and harmless. It was not unusual for celebrities to host small gatherings after nights out, and to many, such offers carried an air of exclusivity. Lana accepted. Soon after, she joined Phil as they left the venue. The pair were driven by his chauffeur, Adriano de Souza, who would later play a significant role in recounting the events of that night. De Souza, who spoke limited English, was accustomed to long hours at his employer's service. His role was simple: to remain available and ready, no matter how late the night extended. The car wound its way through the darkened streets of Los Angeles, eventually climbing toward Spector's residence, an extravagant estate perched high on a hilltop in Alhambra, famously nicknamed the Pyrenees Castle. The mansion, with its 33 rooms, Gothic-inspired design, and looming presence, reflected both grandeur and isolation. For Spector, it was more than a home. It was a fortress, a symbol of his wealth, and a retreat from the world that both celebrated and mistrusted him. At approximately 3 a.m., the vehicle rolled up the long driveway and stopped at the castle gates. Lana and Phil exited together, stepping inside the imposing residence, while Adriano remained in the car as instructed. His orders were clear and routine. Wait until needed. Alone in the driveway, he sat quietly, unaware that the night ahead would soon be recounted and scrutinized by investigators and journalists for years to come. For a time, the night at the Pyrenees Castle appeared uneventful, even quiet. From the driveway where Adriano de Souza sat waiting in the car, the enormous mansion loomed in stillness. Hours passed without incident, the lights glowing faintly from within. But at around 5 o'clock in the morning, the calm shattered. Out of the silence came a sudden, piercing sound that echoed across the property. It was sharp, startling, and unmistakable to Adriano's ears. In that instant, His heart froze. His first thought was that it was the crack of a gunshot. Paralyzed with fear, Adriano stared at the castle's heavy doors and windows, hoping for some sign of what was happening inside. Every second dragged like an eternity. The driver strained to listen, his mind racing, yet the house soon fell back into a suffocating quiet. Then, minutes later, the front door opened. Phil Spector stepped into view. He appeared unsteady on his feet, moving awkwardly as though disoriented. In his hand, Adriano saw the gleam of a pistol. For the driver, who had remained loyal and silent through many long nights, this was the moment when dread turned into certainty. Something terrible had happened. Terrified, he picked up his phone and dialed 911. His words were urgent as he told the operator what he had just witnessed. When police officers arrived at the estate, the scene they encountered was tense and bewildering. Spector stood at the entrance, visibly intoxicated, his behavior erratic and detached. He ignored direct commands, refusing to raise his hands, speaking as though he were not fully aware of the seriousness of the situation. It took officers several minutes of firm, careful maneuvering before they were able to gain entry to the home. Inside, the discovery confirmed the driver's worst fears. Lana Clarkson was no longer alive. The grand, cavernous mansion, usually a symbol of wealth and prestige, now held the shadow of a tragedy that would capture national attention. From that point forward, Spector's behavior only deepened suspicions. He quickly began changing his story, shifting his account depending on who was listening. According to Adriano, Spector had already admitted outside that he thought he had harmed someone. Yet, to investigators, he now claimed that Lana had acted alone. At other times, he suggested that the event was accidental. None of his explanations fit the physical evidence. Police placed him under arrest on the spot. Their search of the sprawling estate uncovered more disturbing details. Along with the pistol, they found 8 additional firearms stored in various rooms. In one of the bathrooms, investigators also noted biological traces, further reinforcing their concerns about Spector's behavior inside the castle. The following day, February 4th, 2003, Phil Spector secured his release. For him, posting bail of $1 million was little more than a formality. His fortune made the sum negligible. With the stroke of a pen, he walked free, at least temporarily. For more than 6 years, as the case wound its way through the complicated machinery of the American justice system, he remained out of prison, still surrounded by wealth, but now shadowed by suspicion. In 2006, Spector married Rochelle Short, a woman who had been close to him both personally and professionally. The marriage raised eyebrows among observers, with some suggesting it was not purely romantic but strategic. Under certain legal protections, a spouse could not be compelled to testify against a partner. Whether or not this was Spector's intention, the move did little to slow the progress of the case against him. The first trial began in March 2007, with Spector facing the charge of second-degree murder. The courtroom was filled with tension. Journalists lined the halls, and the proceedings were followed closely by both the press and the public. Yet despite months of testimony, the trial ended in September without resolution. Jurors could not reach a unanimous verdict, and the case concluded in mistrial. For Spector, it was a temporary reprieve. But the prosecution did not relent. A second trial was scheduled, this time beginning in October 2008. Unlike the first, this trial was broadcast on television, allowing the entire country to witness the drama inside the courtroom. Viewers saw a man who was unpredictable and often combative. He cycled through lawyers, clashed openly with his defense team, and at times offered strange and self-sabotaging statements. He described himself as bipolar, admitted to being his own worst enemy, and spoke cryptically about inner demons. As the trial progressed, testimony revealed patterns from his past. The prosecution called forward multiple women who described eerily similar experiences with Spector. 5 of them shared accounts that painted a chilling consistency. In nearly every case, alcohol was involved, and Spector's controlling, threatening behavior escalated. Two of the women had even contacted police years earlier, though they later withdrew their complaints. The testimony showed that Lana's story was not isolated. It was part of a disturbing history. Even his own family did not shield him. One of his sons publicly described him as a psychopath, a label that cut through the defense's attempt to frame Spector as eccentric but harmless. Yet the most critical testimony came from Adriano de Souza, the driver who had witnessed that night firsthand. Calm, consistent, and unwavering, Adriano repeated his account in detail, that Phil Spector had stepped out of his mansion with a gun in hand and admitted aloud that he thought he had killed someone. His words, steady and unchanged since the first 9/11 call, carried immense weight with the jury. After 9 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. The prosecution's portrayal of Spector as a brilliant but dangerous man had prevailed. On May 29, 2009, Phil Spector was found guilty of second-degree murder. The sentence was severe but fitting for the crime: 19 years to life in prison, without the possibility of parole for nearly 2 decades. The castle that once symbolized Spector's triumphs now stood as a reminder of his downfall. The man who had revolutionized music, who had stood alongside legends, and who had once been celebrated as a genius, ended his days not on a stage or in a studio, but behind the walls of a prison cell. As the clerk read aloud the verdict, guilty of second-degree murder, all eyes turned to Spector. Many expected an outburst, some display of emotion, perhaps even a denial or protest. Instead, there was nothing. Witnesses described him as completely still, almost statuesque. His expression never changed, his voice never broke the silence. A reporter from a major news network later remarked that he looked like a man frozen in time, unwilling to give the world any satisfaction through reaction. Whether it was shock, defiance, or simply the final act of a man used to hiding behind carefully crafted personas, no one could say. But that moment became a lasting image. The legendary producer, once celebrated for shaping the sound of an era, now condemned and unresponsive as the law closed in around him. Life behind bars did not quiet Spector's presence in the headlines. Even in prison, his name carried weight and controversy. In 2016, he sent a letter to a court requesting a divorce from his wife, Rochelle Short. In it, he accused her of extravagance, claiming she had drained his $35 million fortune with reckless spending on high-end cars, designer wardrobes, and lavish international trips. The marriage had long been a subject of curiosity in the media, and these accusations only fueled further speculation. Ultimately, the divorce never went through, but the dispute underscored how, even confined, Spector continued to live through drama. He also clung to the eccentric image he had cultivated for decades. During interviews given from prison, Spector was often photographed wearing oversized sunglasses, flamboyant wigs, or unusual clothing choices. It was as though he refused to shed the persona of the enigmatic producer who had once dominated studios and headlines alike. For some, these appearances reinforced the impression of a man who had always blurred the line between genius and instability. For others, they suggested someone unable or unwilling to face the reality of his downfall. As the years passed, time and fate began to catch up with him. Once known for his fiery energy in the studio and his larger-than-life presence, Spector grew frail within the confines of incarceration. The prison environment, strict and regimented, stood in stark contrast to the castle he once owned, filled with excess and grandeur. Aging, isolated, and no longer in control of the narrative, he became a figure remembered less for his innovations and more for the crime that had defined his later years. On January 16, 2021, Phil Spector's life came to an end. He was 81 years old. According to official reports, the cause was complications related to COVID-19, which he had contracted weeks earlier while incarcerated. After experiencing severe breathing problems, he was rushed from his prison cell to a nearby hospital. Doctors worked to stabilize him, but his condition deteriorated, and despite their efforts, he could not be saved.